Okay, great. So welcome everybody to the session on macroeconomic identification using high frequency and microdata, sponsored by the Society of Computational Economics. We have an excellent set of speakers and discussants this afternoon. So just briefly about the rules of the game. So we're going to have 20 minutes for presentation, 7 minutes for discussion, and then 3 minutes for questions from the participants. Now, if each presenter could please state at the beginning how they'd like to handle questions during the presentation. So whether you take them along the way or you want to have them at the end. And then if I could ask everybody who is not speaking to mute themselves to avoid background noise. Given that we're already 3 minutes behind schedule, without further ado, our first speaker is Xavier Gabet, and who will talk about granular instrumental variables. Take it away.
Great, thank you, Christian. I propose to take the question at the very end, just because of a short time span. So this is joint work with Ralph Coyden here. And so the goal is to have a kind of new way to construct instruments, mostly like macro context or asset pricing context where instruments are particularly scarce. And we call that, it's a fairly systematic source of instruments. We call that granular instrumental variables. So the intellectual background is that if you think about what causes aggregate fluctuations to quantities or prices, a lot is due to idiosyncratic shocks to large firms or large countries or large industries or large hedge funds, depending on the market you have in mind. And sometimes it's called granular shocks because you have those grains of volatility coming from those idiosyncratic actors. And so the idea of a granular IV, GIV, is to use first to tease apart those idiosyncratic shocks by the largest actors, by all actors, but really we care about the largest. And we're going to use them as instruments, as primitive disturbances to the whole economy, and see how they affect aggregate prices and aggregate and individual quantities of the other players. And so that's going to allow us to estimate elasticity of supply, elasticity of demand, various kind of macro multipliers. And we think it has a lot of applicability, and I'll show you one particular empirical example. Okay, you might often people say, what's the difference with Bartik? One way to think about it, Bartik instruments are great to think about the cross section. So maybe like in Nakamura Stenson, I give $1 more to California than to Oregon. What happens to California versus Oregon? It doesn't allow you to think about, to estimate the aggregate impact, whereas GIV typically do allow you to estimate the aggregate impact, at least if you have a long enough time series. Okay, so let me start with, so this is important, notations. XE will be an equal weighted average of variable X size, and XS will be a size weighted average. The sum of the size indices will be added up to 1. And X gamma, gamma like granular, often will be the difference between size weighted and equal weighted. That's the most basic version, and then we'll make it much more jazzy. Okay, so here's a simple model to think about it. So you have N countries, they have a certain demand for oil. Country I typically has a size SI of the stock of the oil market of oil consumption, but today in date T, it has a demand disturbance YIT that's has an idiosyncratic shock UIT, and those will be the center of the analysis. But it has also, country I, some loading on the vector of aggregate shocks eta T, and the loading in some lambda IT. So the aggregate demand for oil in the whole world is the sum of the demands. So it will depend on Y ST, the size weighted sum of the percentage demand disturbances YIT. Here the demand is not price elastic. Very soon I will make it price elastic. So just to zoom in on the core GIV idea. It's the supply that's price elastic, and there's an inverse price elasticity. Alpha PT is like the price of the log price. So in equilibrium, the price adjusts, so that supply equals demand. And so you're going to get that the price is this inverse elasticity alpha times YST being the size-weighted demand shock for oil in the economy. And what we want to do is estimate alpha. And now, very naively, one might want to regress or do an OLS, but it won't be consistent because, I'm not sure why I jumped. It won't be consistent because, here we go, epsilon t and eta t could be correlated. So epsilon t and the total quantity change will be correlated. So, but however, in the GIV, we assume that the idiosyncratic shocks are truly idiosyncratic. In particular, they are orthogonal to eta t, epsilon t, the common shocks. So it means we have run a good enough factor model, and that will be an issue down the road. So once you have that, so let's take first the simplest case, where there's just a aggregate time fixed effect eta t, and all the countries have the same loading of 1, just to clarify ideas. Then you can construct the GIV, and in that the GIV is very simple here. You take the size-weighted demand change or consumption change minus the equal weighted demand change. Then the common factor cancels out, and so you just get just a mixture of idiosyncratic shocks. And morally speaking, is the size-weighted average idiosyncratic shock, but minus a little residual. And so the GIV, it can be constructed from observables, namely the change in demands, but inside the logic of the model, it's just made of idiosyncratic shocks. As a result, it's orthogonal to the common shock, so it's going to be a legitimate instrument. Okay, so it's both exogenous, meaning orthogonal to the common shock, and also generically it's relevant. And then you estimate the demand elasticity as the covariance between the GIV and the price divided by the covariance between the GIV and the aggregate quantity. And in practice, you're going to take the empirical covariances of a finite sample of time t. Okay, so here we were surprised at first when we have a new way, if you want, to estimate the demand supply elasticity in a very classic, otherwise demand and supply framework. We use the disaggregated demands and morally the fact that there are few large countries. Why do I do that? Why do I say that? That's because if you look at what's the precision of the estimator, so it's root. If you have you need always a large time series of size t, then it's root t, consistent, and the standard error of the estimator will be sigma alpha divided by square root of t. Sigma alpha is the noisiness of the estimator, and so the estimator is very precise, has low volatility. If you have large idiosyncratic shocks, so countries have large idiosyncratic shocks, and there's a high Herfindahl of sizes in the economy. H is this Herfindahl measure. Basically, it means you have one, at least, in practice, a few large countries. So morally speaking, the idea of a GIV, you look at the idiosyncratic shock, demand shock for oil by China, by Brazil, etc. And that's going to be a demand shifter in the old world demand for oil. That's going to affect the price of oil. And so this is how you can estimate the aggregate supply elasticity for oil. Okay, and so this kind of formalizes how all those forces are at work there. So this is a very, very basic GIV idea. And once you have it, it's easy to extend in lots of different ways. And so that's what we do in the paper. For instance, here I have fixed sizes, but you can have time varying sizes. It's exactly the same thing. And what if the shocks are heteroscedastic? What if you have a richer factor structure? So let me show you some of the main enrichments that we have in the paper. So a very simple one is if shocks are heteroscedastic, it's exactly what I showed you, except instead of taking the equal weighted demand change, you take the precision weighting, which is inverse idiosyncratic variance weighted, and then that's what you want for the GIV, the size weighted minus inverse precision weighted or pseudo equal weighted demand change, and that's going to be your the instrument that we recommend. Why is it? Now you might say all those idiosyncratic shocks by each little country is potentially is a legitimate instrument. So why take the size weighted one? That's because it's actually the optimal one. So if you say I have a GMM, I have all those instruments, and I want to find what's the optimal way to combine them. Actually, that's what this proposition here says. The optimal way to combine all those idiosyncratic country shocks, each of which basically is an instrument, is to form the size-weighted idiosyncratic shock. And that's what the GIV, and actually that size and precision weighted. So you want to do size-weighted sum of idiosyncratic shock minus the equal weighted. And that's the GMM optimal estimator, and it's and in particular it says that there's no need to have another set of estimators. There's no need to have to partition into two estimators, for instance, two sets of estimators, because this is the optimal combination. You cannot do better than that. However, you could imagine if you want to do over-identifying restrictions, you could imagine having, say, shocks to high GDP countries or high GDP per capita countries, low GDP per capita countries, have two sets of GIVs, and then this way you would get over-identifying restrictions. But if you pass them, the optimal way is the one I showed you. You check all the idiosyncratic shocks together, and that's the optimal GIV. Now, something that's very important is there could be a much richer factor structure than the common additive shock that I showed you earlier. So in general, let's imagine we have a factor model where country I, its demand depends on its idiosyncratic shock, and also there are R factors, eta TF for factor F, and the country I could have some loading lambda I F on factor F. But we do maintain the assumption that the idiosyncratic demand shocks are orthogonal to those common factors. Basically, we have a good enough factor model. And so we have propositions in the paper, but informally what we do, you do a factor model on these demand shocks, okay? You extract this way the residuals, your proxies for idiosyncratic shocks, and you form the GIV, which is the size minus equal weighted of those residual idiosyncratic shocks. And that's the GIV that you want to use. And we have much more formal assumptions about when it's consistent, etc., etc. Under simple conditions, especially if it's all parametric, then it's exactly consistent and optimal and perfect. If it's non-parametric, it's a bit more subtle. So let me not go there. Now, so far we had talked about supply and demand, but with inelastic demand. So now let me go to full generality. We've also elastic demand. So suppose YIT, my demand depend, or demand of country I, depends on the price with some demand elasticity phi D. Presumably it's negative, but we don't impose that. And also the idiosyncratic shock, and also here just this simple additive common shock. The supply also has some supply elasticity phi S. So then the question is estimating the demand elasticity and the supply elasticity. Here note, I assume that all the countries have the same demand elasticity, but we can also do heterogeneous demand elasticity. It's just the same ideas, but more notations and more. So here, just giving you the simplest to communicate case. So anyway, so this is the model. In equilibrium supply equals demand, we solve for the price, and you're going to get, for instance, that the aggregate price will depend on this size-weighted idiosyncratic demand shock times some multiplier M over phi S, which is a mixture of those demand and supply elasticities. Likewise, the aggregate quantity of oil consumed or produced, is the same in equilibrium in the world, is going to be the size-weighted idiosyncratic demand shock times some multiplier M that depends on the elasticities. And then the charm, so, and of course you cannot, and then the charm, so what you do, you form the GIV again in the same ways, size minus equal weighted demand changes. It's orthogonal to all the common shocks. And then as a theorem, it's actually legitimate to just run OLS. So you run, you run by OLS the price on the GIV here to be ZT on the GIV, and you're going to have a consistent unbiased, etc. estimate of M, the multiplier, divided by phi S, the supply elasticity. You can regress the quantity on the GIV, and then you get also a consistent unbiased estimate of the GIV. It turns out that on top of that, as a bonus, the OLS standard errors are correct. So even though the GIV is constructed, once you have a parametric model, then the OLS standard errors are correct. So that's like an additional thing that simplifies one's life. Okay. Here we go. Like I said, you can do over-identification tests. You would decompose maybe the idiosyncratic shocks into two types of countries. You do their size-weighted average for both types of countries, and you see using the GIV with the Z1 versus the Z2 gives you the same estimate. When is the GIV robust? So it's robust to lots of things, except having a wrong factor model. So let me explain. If you keep some shocks but not the others, it still all works. If you assume homogeneous elasticities, though the hedges are heterogeneous, it's still correct, except what you measure is the equal weighted elasticity. If you're a bit wrong with the sizes, again, at least the IV version is still correct. That's always because IV is robust to measurement error, or a lot of types of measurement error, and so the GIV inherits that. Where where's the more serious threat to identification is if we didn't get the right factor model. Okay, so there is a true factor model with loadings lambda and shocks eta, and you get some approximate estimation of the factor model. So what's the solution? What would you propose there? First, there's lots of knowledge about factor models by Anger and lots of other people. And you can add factors to your model, you see what happens. You can do other identification tests. You can do narrative checks. You look at the top events, see what happens. And so we talk about that. So let me now talk about the general procedure. Let me show you the empirical example that we have in the last 4 minutes, I think, that I have. So we're interested in the past euro crisis and the future euro crisis. And the idea is, let's call YIT, that's your yield spread compared to Germany. And we are interested in if say Greece has a negative shock, so that increases its yield compared to Germany. In practice, you see the yield of the other European countries going up. Okay, and why? There's some sort of spillover or negative contagion. And so we have an economic model in the appendix that here I give you the message from model. And the model says if Greece defaults, the other countries will need to chip in, and that will jeopardize their financial health, and so their debt rating, their debt will be less likely to be repaid. Anyway, so if you in the model you say if Greece has an idiosyncratic shock, well, all the countries have an idiosyncratic shock, and their yield compared to Germany is going to increase, or the log yield actually, proportionally to the idiosyncratic shock, but also to the size-weighted change in the yield in the other countries. Okay, and that's the contagion effect. So we're interested in measuring this gamma. So what we do, the model also delivers the proper measure of size, and size is not your GDP, is the size of your debt compared to your yield spread compared to Germany. It's like the amount of euros that could you might default of in expectation. We use the daily data, or weekly data actually, daily data, sorry. We run the totally general procedure. I'll show you what it looks like. This is what the yield spreads look like. And so so we extract this way the ZT, the size-weighted sum of the idiosyncratic yield shock day by day. We regress the size-weighted change in the yield or log yield across all these European countries. And as a theorem, again, the estimate here will be the multiplier, which is 1 over this 1 minus gamma. A multiplier bigger than 1 means there's positive spillover across the Eurozone. And so here you see, if you don't control for any principal components, you get some estimate. Then if you always want to control for at least one principal component, the estimate goes to 1.29. And then two principal components, the estimate goes to 1.2. Three principal components, the estimate kind of stabilizes 1.2. That's how we say we hopefully have a good factor model. We can do more formal tests. And so we get this multiplier of 1.2. So again, what's the interpretation is that if Italy has a bad shock and suffers and its debt falls with an expected dollar loss of 1 billion euros, the debt of the other countries has a higher yield, and the expected loss for the Eurozone is $1.25 billion. So there was this extra spillover. Okay, you can do a narrative check, checking that the top events for the GIV, that the size of the event and the size of the country at stake, you can look at what happened on those days and check narratively that they were truly idiosyncratic. And then you can do GIV to do much more in terms of macro identification. Take the Otto et al. China shock. It works for one period when the China entered the WTO, but not later. Whereas here you could have a China shock every quarter as countries have good export productivity shocks, especially the large countries. You could see how foreign inflows by mutual funds affect exchange rates. There's a paper by Ellen Ray and co-authors using GIV to do that. You could say there's an increase in concentration to labor markets, but because some large firms had an increased size. What happens to wages and employment? This way you can measure monopsony. There's a paper by Schubert and Stansbury also using the GIV to do that. You can see there are flows in the stock market, how much did the stock market go up. We used the GIV. We actually developed a GIV for that in a separate paper with Ralph. Anyway, you can have networks-based GIV. There are lots you can do. Let me stop. It's a simple idea, really, with potentially many applications, and obviously we think it's kind of a useful way to do identification in macro finance. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Xavier, for a fantastic presentation. The discussant is Jim Hamilton.
Jim, we can't hear you. You're muted. Jim, you're muted. We couldn't hear you.
Thank you. All I said was your paper was great, and that you had some gave a lot of thought to coming up with some nice notation that to express the ideas. Myself wanting to think about what you were doing in some notation that was more familiar to me, and so the do is discussed. I'm going to follow the authors in measuring everything in deviations from the mean, so we don't have constant terms cluttering up the equations. So let Q denote the log of the oil production of country I. So that's one thing I'm doing differently from them. PT is the log of the price of oil. Consider a supply curve that's linear in logs. So phi Q is the elasticity of supply, which I'm going, for this example, to take the same across all countries. And there's a common shock to supply, eta TQ, that's across all countries, and then an idiosyncratic component, UIT. And let Q without a subscript denote the log of the total world production. Now, the log of the sum is not equal to the sum of the logs, but you can take a first order Taylor approximation to approximate the log of the sum as a constant, which I'm ignoring, plus a weighted sum of the logs, where the weights turn out to be the share, the weight for country I is the share of country I in total world production, share at the point that you take the linearization. And those share parameters, SIQ, sum to 1 by definition. So let's take that supply curve for country I, multiply it by the share of country I in the total, sum over I. On the left side, we have this weighted sum of country production, which is approximately the log of world production. On the right side, because we have the same phi q parameter for all countries, we get that phi q times pt term, same in the aggregate. We get the same aggregate factor a to tq, and we get something I'm calling utq, which is a weighted sum of the individual idiosyncratic shocks. So likewise, you could take the log of oil consumption for country I and suppose that the demand curve is linear in logs with some elasticity of demand given by phi c, which again, I'll take to be common across all countries. Shock to demand that has a common component to A to TC, and then an idiosyncratic component shock to demand. In the same way, we can aggregate to take the log of total world consumption as a weighted average of the logs of individual country consumption. And we get something that looks like an aggregate demand curve, where CT on the left is the log of world consumption and the same elasticity of demand on the right side. So the standard assumption, thinking about things this way, is that all of the idiosyncratic components of demand are uncorrelated with the idiosyncratic components of supply, and also uncorrelated with that aggregate shock to supply. So we got a supply curve, production depends on price, a demand curve, consumption depends on price. In equilibrium, consumption should equal production. So you can solve out the price as a function of these shocks. And of course, you can't estimate the supply curve by OLS because the error in the supply equation, A to TQ plus UTQ, is correlated with the price. When there's an increase in supply, of course, the price goes down. But if you compare the individual country demand curve, CIT, with the world consumption, CT, the difference between those. So ZIT is just the difference between the log of country I consumption and the log of world consumption relative to the historical mean. And in that difference, the dependence on the price falls out. The dependence on the aggregate factor in demand falls out. And you just have something that depends only on the idiosyncratic component of demand. The difference between log of country I production, log of world production only depends on the idiosyncratic components. And that means it's uncorrelated with the shock to the supply curve. But it is correlated with the price. When demand goes up, the price goes up. So ZIT, the difference between country I consumption and world consumption, is a valid instrument for estimating the supply curve. And in fact, you could use ZITC for any country. Any country is a valid instrument for this. So you have N instruments, which is great. You've got over-identifying assumptions here. You can test them. You can see whether this is a valid framework. And or you could use any linear combination of these ZITs. And if the idiosyncratic components were uncorrelated, what you'd want to do optimally is take a weighted average .
Okay, I guess we lost Jim there.
Hi, Jim. If you can hear us, if you want to try and turn off your camera and resume your audio only, that might be the best bet going forward.
Jim, are you still here? No, apparently we lost him. That's unfortunate. I guess I give it 15 more seconds. If anybody has a question in the meantime.
Yeah, maybe I have a small question. So in the examples that I saw, at least, there was nothing idiosyncratic to supply. So I was wondering if this is tailored to that specific setting, or whether you could jointly think about settings with idiosyncratic supply and demand shocks. And then maybe
so you're very exactly right. So in our example, there was just this aggregate supply, and what Jim did is extend our example with both disaggregated supply and disaggregated demand. And then you can do even more things. But I guess we started with just an aggregate supply, just to make the point that it's okay to have just a one-sided disaggregation. You don't need the two-sided disaggregation, though you have like even more over identifying restrictions or precision with two-sided disaggregation.
Yeah, so I guess as a follow-up to that, at this point in the paper, I guess you focus mostly on what are essentially reduced form shocks at the individual level. So I wonder, once you have both supply and demand at the idiosyncratic level, what would you suggest doing then? You
would do essentially exactly what we're doing. The procedure really works. It's just an extra luxury if you have. Jim is back, so Jim will.
Okay. Great.
Jim, are you back?
Jim.
I am back, but I used up all my time, I assume, but I don't know where you are. What do you want to do? I had some other great points, but it's a great paper. Basically, my bottom line was there are all kinds of testable things here. You can estimate individual elasticities for each country. You can test whether they're the same. And actually, you can embed it in maximum likelihood. Once we know from IV that it's identified, MLE can be given an IV interpretation. And the optimal way to do all of this is just to throw everything in a VAR where the various assumptions we've been talking about end up as a restriction on the variance covariance matrix of the residuals. And so it's kind of a familiar idea that way.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Jim. Our next speaker is Ferre de Grave, and he's going to talk about identifying sectoral shocks with a modicum of economic theory. Take it away.
Thanks, Christiana, for putting in the work for this session, this great session, and thanks to Christian for taking the time to look at our paper. I probably would also defer most questions, except perhaps clarifying questions to the end. So what we're doing is somewhat related to the first presentation, in that we're going to go after idiosyncratic shocks and the role that they play in aggregate fluctuations. And so you can think, as a broad overview of what we do, is we're going to use VAR style methods, but take them into the cross section. And that's going to buy us identification, and it's going to solve this identification problem that differs us from getting straight answers about how important are idiosyncratic shocks, and in my case that'll be sector specific shocks, for aggregate economic activity and co-movement. So we all know some version of this graph, which is essentially industrial production in the US. And so we've seen this go through different stages. So we've seen the pre-grade moderation volatility, after which we've seen sort of subdued volatility in macro time series. And then with the start of the Great Recession, we've seen particularly harsh recessions happen on occasion. And so a lot of the empirical macro literature is trying to figure out what is causing these recessions. And so a defining feature of these booms and busts in aggregate economic activity is that co-movement across sectors. And so this is essentially the same graph as the one I had before, but now it's smoothed. And that's the solid red, the thick red line. And the smaller lines are the industrial production series that we have for 25 sectors in the US economy. And so that defining feature of economic activity is not just those stages that economic activity went through, the Great Recession, Great Moderation, etc. But it's also that high degree of co-movement across sectors. And so, as empirical macroeconomists, we want to understand what is driving this co-movement. And so, a lot of the literature has focused the last couple of decades on, what are sort of the macro shocks driving these business cycles. And so we have various candidates within, so demand and supply shocks. There's different sources of demand shocks, different sources of supply, if you will. Lots of focus on fiscal and monetary policy. And then with some of the work of Xavier, but also others, there's been more of attention on what are potential micro drivers of these aggregate fluctuations. And so what we'll be focusing on in this talk is mostly sectoral shocks with aggregate consequences. And so, by the way, we here is me and Jan David, who's also in the room and available for questions. So the challenge to figuring out what is driving these business cycles, whether it's aggregate or something idiosyncratic, is really a fundamental identification problem. So, are these sectors co-moving because there's an aggregate shock which affects all the sectors? Or on the other hand, is there idiosyncratic sectors or disaggregate shocks that hit the economy that then spill over and affect all the other sectors? And so the answers we have up to today are, on the one hand, reduced form answers that we can just figure out from reduced form empirical models. And there's some answers from highly specified DSG models that are taken to the data. And so what we're trying to do here is come up with something in between, say, VAR-like evidence on what are the sources of aggregate business cycles. And so that's going to make us less susceptible to potential misspecification concerns that you might have about these highly stylized models that are currently receiving a lot of attention, which have input-output interactions across sectors, for instance. And we've seen plenty of examples of those even today in other sessions. Okay, so the approach that we're going to take is we're going to think of theory and think of, okay, what are, we need theory to solve the identification problem. And so rather than think of traditional VAR identification techniques that typically work on imposing a certain restriction in the time domain, or maybe say that one variable does not respond to another, or that certain variables respond with a certain sign, what we'll do instead is we'll think of restrictions that theory implies in the cross-sectional dimension. And so we're going to think about different cross-sectional responses across sectors that will now enable us to distinguish these idiosyncratic from more aggregate shocks. So intuitively, what we do is we take from theory an understanding of how shocks, idiosyncratic shocks, transmit through the cross-section. We're going to realize that that differs from how aggregate shocks transmit through a production network. And we're going to use that information as identification information. So, the network literature has spent a lot of time on studying different measures of network interactions. What we'll do is we'll use one of the most common measures, which is the Leontief inverse coming from input-output data. So once we have these theoretically implied cross-sectional implications of most theories, what we'll do is we'll take that information and impose it in an empirical model. That empirical model you can think of as a VAR. Our specific application is going to use a factor augmented VAR, but for conceptually, that's not really important. That's just going to help us to reduce parameterization in a high dimensional setting. So we'll take the ranks that theory implies, and we're going to impose them as identifying restrictions, but in the cross-sectional dimension. If you want, you can call that heterogeneity restrictions rather than timing restrictions or sign restrictions or elasticity restrictions or whatnot. Okay, so here's just a very stylized example to give you the idea. So consider a sector, consider an economy that consists of 5 sectors only, and that has a very simple network structure. So there's 5 sectors, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They're linked to each other through a network. So sector 1 sells to 3, which sells to 5 with different intensities, which are these numbers here. And then there's another sector 2 that sells to 4 and that sells to sector 5. So that's our very stylized example. So now let's consider what happens to an economy that has this structure when there's different shocks that hit it. So the first example would be what happens if there's a shock to sector 1, an idiosyncratic shock. So what will happen is that shock it originates in sector 1, transmits to sector 3, and affects sector 5. Whereas there's not going to be any impact on sectors 2 and 4 here. So conditional on a sector-specific shock in sector 1, we're going to get this ranking of how the cross-section of sectors is affected. Sector 1 is going to be affected the most, then 3, then 5, and 2 and 4 not at all. Now consider again the same economy, but let's consider what happens when there's an idiosyncratic shock hitting the second sector. So that's going to transmit from sector 2 into the sectors itself, to both directly and indirectly. So conditional on an idiosyncratic shock in sector 2, we'll now get the following cross-sectional ranking of how production in each sector is affected. So sector 2 is going to be affected more than 4, which will be affected more than 5, and sectors 1 and 3 are going to be affected the least. So that's how we can identify, if in the simple economy, thinking of that cross-sectional difference, that's how we can think of how a sector-specific shock in sector 1 will differ from shock in sector 2. Now, that's part of the identification challenge, but there's the bigger challenge, which is also how do we disentangle these from aggregate shocks? And so consider again in this simple economy, what would happen after an aggregate shock? We can think of an aggregate shock as, say, some linear combination of idiosyncratic shocks. So let's think of a shock that affects both sectors 1 and 2 at the same time. And let's consider how that trickles down through this economy. And so what you'll see, the specifics here aren't really important, but what you'll see is that the impact an aggregate shock has is basically going to mix these first two graphs. So these directed graphs are now going to start intermingling. And so the cross-sectional pattern that you'll find in conditional on an aggregate shock is going to be different from that you have conditional on a sector-specific shock. So the ultimate ranking as a result of aggregate shocks is really going to look different across sectors than it does to either of these idiosyncratic shocks. And so that's the basic identification idea. We can look at how that, if that survives in DSG frameworks, and we do. And so essentially, I'll have to speed through this a little bit, but essentially within the typical models that we see, the ranking measures like Leontief inverse would be close to a sufficient statistic for sectoral shock transmission through production networks. And so we're going to use that idea, and we verify that that holds, that our identification strategy holds in these DSG models, and we'll apply that through an empirical model of production as we saw it in these first two empirical graphs. So, I don't think I have the time to go in much detail, but essentially what we're showing here is if you look at the cross-sectional ranking at which sectors are affected in, say, the model of Vasco-Carvalho, then what you see is that the Leontief inverse after a shock that hits sector 13, so an idiosyncratic shock there, that Leontief inverse is going to be close to sufficient statistic for impulse response functions. And that will look very different to what happens when there's an aggregate shock. So that cross-sectional ranking that you get here will look conditional on an aggregate shock will be very different from what you get conditional on any idiosyncratic shock. So that's, we have the basic intuition for identification. We've verified it within DSG models that have these input-output structures. And now what remains to do is we're going to take that to the data. Of course, this relates to a lot of literature, both the theoretical literature on production networks. There's some quantifications out there, but as said, they're very heavily reliant on the specific DSG structures that are typically analytically easy to work with. And so what we'll do is we'll step away a bit from that while still enabling structural identification, if you will. And so we relate to some other work, including that of ours, discussant. So as said, this is the identification setup. You can apply that to any reduced form model you want. What we'll do is we'll impose these identification restrictions in a factor, VAR, so we'll have information on production in 25 or 26 sectors. That's a standard factor model. There's some dynamics here. What Xavier talked about was mostly these shocks, these idiosyncratic shocks behind ET. What I'll be after instead is what's behind these shocks UT. So these shocks UT are at this point reduced form objects, which are going to drive this factor F, which in turn drive co-movement that jointly explains the dynamics of this XT. Okay, so we're going to take these Leontief measures, these network measures. If you prefer another one, you can look at that. We'll distinguish between both upstream and downstream propagation. So from the theoretical literature, we know that supply shocks by and large will mostly transmit or trickle downstream if you want. We'll take that into account to our network measures. We'll also allow for there to be shocks that only trickle upwards, if you will. So we can incorporate all of that pretty easily, in fact. Okay, so I don't want to spend much time on details of the empirical approach. Just think of a VAR, if you will, and we're after identifying certain shocks. What I maybe do want you to get from this figure is, from this table, is that we're allowing for different subsamples, and you'll see that in the graphs. Again, lots of details which I'm happy to spend some more time about, but I'm not sure if I have the time. So let me defer that to later. Okay, so the results that I'm going to present to you is what is the contribution of these identified sector-specific shocks to aggregate economic activity. And so the results are basically all going to fit in graphs like these. And this graph is essentially the same one as we've seen before. So we have industrial production in the US. So that's the red line. We have different shaded colors in this graph, which is apart from the usual NBER recessions. That's also because we allow different parameter estimates across these periods. But that's whatever I'm saying here is also going to hold for a full sample estimate, by and large. And so the first result is really that these sector-specific shocks that we identify in this way actually do a pretty good job in explaining aggregate economic activity. And so that's what the black line here is showing. So that black line is the contribution of sector-specific shocks to aggregate economic activity. And so the bird's eye view of this figure is, well, that seems like a great match, right? So there's definitely a role for these idiosyncratic shocks. Looking a little bit more in detail, what we see is that, well, especially in this middle sample, so the great moderation, that these lines lie particularly close to each other. And that sort of confirms what we know from the earlier DSG literature, which says that the role of aggregate shocks was particularly high pre-great moderation, but a bit less during the great moderation. And what you can see in this pre-great moderation part of our sample is that difference between the black and the red line, which, if you will, is a measure for the scope of aggregate shocks to contribute to aggregate activity, is larger in this blue sample compared to this great moderation sample, if you will. The last thing I want to indicate from this graph is that the pandemic really is a very different animal. So the pandemic, these sector-specific shocks contribute to aggregate economic activity, but only, say, about a third, which is very different from earlier recessions. So, if you will, one interpretation of this is that aggregate shocks in the pandemic really are back with a vengeance. Even they've never contributed as much as we've seen before. So, of course, this graph is we're identifying shocks for each of these 25 sectors, and this is sort of the culmination of all of those. You might ask, okay, what's behind these? And so the second result that we have is really that the shocks that seem important in driving economic activity also seem to fit the typical macro narrative that we have in mind. So two examples here. The first is if we look at the 2001 recession, which is this one. So what this graph is showing us is, again, red line is aggregate economic activity. The other lines are telling you what is the contribution of idiosyncratic shocks that stem from the computer and electronic products sector. And so what you can see in this graph is, first of all, in the mid-90s, you start seeing that positive contribution of, let me call them tech shocks. So you start observing the tech bubble, if you will, early on in the mid-90s. And at the same time, the recession that follows in 2001 is actually, again, the method seems to identify that is coming from negative shocks hitting that specific sector. Contribution is also substantial in driving aggregate economic activity down. The second example would be to look at, say, the Great Recession. And we all, we like to think of the Great Recession as stemming from the housing market. So we don't really have housing nor construction in industrial production. The closest thing that we have would be wood products. And so wood products is a sector that very early on, that is highly related to construction, and that even before aggregate economic activity started going down, we identify as contributing negatively to economic activity. So this seems to suggest that the narrative of these identified shocks seems to be consistent with what we typically think in macro. The third result, I'm not going to present you graphically, but I'm just going to say that even though we have results for specific sectors seeming to make sense, it's not the case that some of these sectors explain every recession. So every recession comes with its own idiosyncrasy. So let me keep it at that for that result and spend just another minute perhaps on our last result, which is how important are these network spillovers? That's, the theoretical literature pays a lot of attention to that. Also, more broadly, you can think of what are recessions? Are recessions just a coincidence in the sense that there's just a whole bunch of sectors that are hit at the same time by coincidence, that all experience negative shocks? Or are recessions rather a few sectors being hit and then transmitting to other sectors? And so what we see in this graph here is the pink line tells us what the contribution of these sector-specific shocks would be to aggregate economic activity if you took away all the spillovers. And so what you can see is, let's focus, for instance, on the Great Recession, is that if you took away the network effects, then you wouldn't be able to explain the Great Recession very well with these idiosyncratic shocks. And so the measure, the quantitative effect of these network spillovers is easily a doubling of the initial impact of the sector's own impact on aggregate activity, and it extends far beyond 2, even to 3 or more. Okay, I don't know if I don't think I have the time to go into DGP exercises, but we've done those. We've done some simulations to verify whether what we think comes out of the method also comes out in DSG setups, and it does. So let me just conclude by saying these sector-specific disturbances seem like a big source of aggregate volatility. The network effects amplification that they generate seems very large and plausibly large if you look at the theoretical literature. The pandemic is clearly different from other recessions and is really the most aggregate shock we've seen so far, which again, I think accords well with the narrative. And the evidence we've presented here is sort of less hinging on theoretical details that you might want to call into question if you're looking at the theory literature. Okay, thanks a lot. And thank you, Christian, for whatever follows.
Okay, thanks for a very nice presentation, Ferre. And I hand it over to Christian Mattis, who is the discussant.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christiane, for giving me the opportunity to discuss this paper. I really enjoyed reading it, not surprisingly, given that I've worked on broadly similar topics. I really enjoyed it. Let me maximize my screen here. I hope you guys can see my slides. It's always a nerve-wracking moment. Okay, I think you can.
We actually can't.
You can't.
See your background.
Okay, so let me stop sharing and try this again. Sorry for this. Okay. Hopefully now you can see my slides.
Now it's perfect, yes.
Okay, second time's a charm. So this paper is really after a fundamental question, right? What drives economic fluctuations? Is it aggregate shocks or sectoral shocks? Now, whenever you ask that question, and I've asked similar questions in some of my work, more focusing on aggregate shocks, but also using sectoral variation, you got to ask yourself, and this is almost a philosophical question, but it's going to be relevant for what I'm going to say later. What is an aggregate shock? So if there's a big sector of the US economy and that sector is hit by a shock, do we want to call that an aggregate shock or a sectoral shock? Okay, so that's going to be, even though you might say now that's a philosophical question, it's going to come back and it's relevant, I think, for some of the issues studied in this paper. Let me actually give you first a really in a nutshell, like 1 minute description of what Farah and Jan David are doing in this really nice paper. So they're saying, hey, a lot of guys are writing down DSGE models to study the effects of sectoral shocks. And I feel seen a little bit because that's what I'm working on right now, actually. But they want to take a different route. They want to use a statistical model. So what do? Whenever you want to do identification of some set of shocks using a statistical model, you first going to use a statistical model to decompose outcomes, YT, into a predictable component that I have here in blue and an unpredictable component. And then on top of that, you want to find a mapping from the unpredictable component to your structural shocks of interest, right? So the first part is purely statistical. And then here, that's where the economic theory comes in. And that's where the linkages come in, the input-output linkages that Farah and Jan David really nicely explored. So what do? They're going to study upstream and downstream shocks to a subset of 25 IP sectors, okay? Why focus on IP sectors? Well, IP is obviously only a small part of, or not a huge part of the US economy. There's many other things going on, but data availability is great. Okay, so I'm totally on board with that. And you're only going to use basically those IP sectors where you can really distinguish between different clusters of sectors that are important for a specific sector versus not. Now, for each sector, so I want to emphasize here, Farah and Jan David are going to estimate one model per sector, right? So it's going to be a different factor model for each sector. So for each sector, use one factor model to basically figure out how the shocks emanating that specific sector feed into all other sectors. Okay, that's that first component, that's the statistical model. And then on top of that, they're going to use these sign and magnitude restrictions based on input-output tables to identify shocks based on using sign and magnitude restrictions, building obviously on very important work that Farah has done previously. So in a nutshell, I think it's really nice. This is really, I think, a very nice complement to like all the equilibrium models that are out there, and also to work that I've done with Philippe Schwartzman, where we use sectoral variation to identify aggregate shocks, okay? Here, you really have the input-output linkages front and center. Now, I have some questions. And a lot of this is actually already in the paper. So Farah and Jan David are very open about, hey, here are some issues, here's the choices that we make. So it's a really nice paper to read also in that regard. But I want to still ask these questions, but I think they're interesting questions, and I think people are going to think about these. So why one model per sector? In some sense, obviously, if you think about the linkages, like the link between a time series model and an underlying equilibrium model, in some sense, would be nicer to have one big model, but it is hard, right? So as Farah and Jan David point out, it might be hard to identify sectoral shocks. Some sectoral shocks, it might be hard to identify if you put everything together in one big model. I'm also saying, if you use standard magnitude and sign restrictions and standard approaches to identify them, standard computational approaches, think about work by Rubio, Wagner, and Jha, for example. Well, these algorithms are not really geared towards using lots of different restrictions. Okay, they become very slow because they're basically algorithms that try a lot of different candidate values. So there's a lot that can be said for the approach that Farah and Jan David take in the paper, but there are obviously also downsides. So Ferre in the presentation showed basically the aggregate contribution of all these sectoral shocks. It wasn't clear to me exactly in the paper how you arrive at this aggregated value. There's like 1 or 2 lines about it. It would be nice to actually show the math. And then maybe more economically meaningful, obviously, if you do this one model at a time, and Ferre and Jan David say this in the paper, even these sectoral shocks could be correlated. But I think we really need to know how big are these correlations, because maybe there are aggregate shocks hiding underlying actually all these estimated sectoral shocks. Or in other words, what your model views as a sectoral shock, when you take one of these sectoral models, maybe there's still some aggregate stuff going on. And related to that, the key question for me is, especially when you have shocks hitting big sectors of the US economy, can we really disentangle aggregate shocks from sectoral shocks? The paper has a great start to that. It has this Monte Carlo exercise that Ferre mentioned, but I think I would really like to see more. So the sectors, in some sense, in that model are very similar. The model is very simple. It doesn't have a lot of frictions. It doesn't have sticky prices. We know from work by Nakamura and Steinson, different sectors have different price stickiness, for example. That could kind of maybe throw a wrench into your Leontief inverse type identification scheme. So I really would like to see a richer data generating process there. I have high hopes that your approach still works, but I think it would be really nice if you could convince readers of that. And then obviously, I totally understand why you're using industrial production data, because it goes back far, but you could also use other sectoral data, PCE-based data. Obviously, with PCE, you can't really talk about output-based measures, but you can talk about consumption and you can talk about prices. So prices could also give you a lot of information there. And that's basically all I have. So it was kind of a hard job as a discussant, because the paper is really nice, the idea is really nice, and I really had to kind of nitpick. I learned a lot from reading this, and it really, as I said, it's really an important economic question, and I think one that maybe more people should be struggling with. Thank you.
Okay, great, Christian, for the discussion. So I think we have time for maybe one short question, and just to kind of like make the remaining 2 presenters feel a little bit more comfortable. Given the various technological hiccups that we had, our tech host agreed that we could go like 5 to 10 minutes over time, so we can catch up on that. So, so is there a question from the audience? If so, feel free to unmute yourself and just ask right away. No? Okay, well then Daniel Lewis is our next speaker, and he's going to talk about announcement-specific decompositions of unconventional monetary policy shocks and their macroeconomic effects. Go ahead.
I would love to, but I cannot share my screen at the moment.
Okay, I was told that everybody now was a co-host.
I am now a co-host. Let's see if that, aha.
Okay, so the technical hiccups continue.
Okay, can everyone see my slides now? Great. Okay, thanks so much, Christian, for organizing this session, and also Eric for what I'm sure will be a very insightful discussion afterwards. So as Christian mentioned, I'm working on a unique approach, I think, to identifying monetary policy shocks from asset price movements that doesn't assume the same relationships between asset prices and monetary policy shocks hold from one announcement to the next. And this is going to build on the event study literature that comes out of influential work by Ken Cutton in 2001, essentially exploiting the fact that high frequency movements in asset prices like interest rate futures should reflect the surprise component of any monetary policy announcement. Indeed, rather quickly, if we think markets are efficient, all the information from a monetary policy announcement should be processed and reflected in asset prices virtually immediately. This sort of methodology is simple and appealing, but it gets a little trickier when we have multiple dimensions of monetary policy, for example, a Fed funds forward guidance and asset purchase shock. Now we have to do some sort of decomposition between the asset price movements we observe into the monetary policy shocks we wish to study, where there's going to be some sort of contemporaneous response matrix, let's call it H. These are the structural parameters you see in any sort of SBAR setting. So the literature has taken a couple of approaches to this so far. The first is the simplest. You simply can impose exclusion restrictions on the asset prices themselves. For example, you can say short interest rate futures should only react to Fed funds shocks. So you simply read off the movement in those futures as the Fed funds shock. It gets a little trickier to come up with an interest rate that will respond to asset purchases, but not to forward guidance. Much more realistically, I think, the vast majority of the literature has tried to identify the underlying shocks from moments of asset prices, which are computed across announcements. So the influential work from Gerken, ASSA, and Swanson really led the way here, using exclusion restrictions to separate out Fed funds and forward guidance shocks. Rogers, Scotty, and Wright take this a step further to also recover asset purchase shocks. And Eric's work, I think, very cleverly combines these sorts of exclusion restrictions with narrative restrictions to get at asset purchase shocks as well. But these approaches come with some cost because they're essentially pooling information across announcements to estimate the moments they need for identification. Implicitly, this is requiring that H, this contemporaneous response matrix, is constant across announcements, typically for several decades. This crucially is going to mean that the nature of the shocks can't change from one announcement to the next. But when we look at the Great Recession, it's simply the case that shocks don't appear to have been the same from one announcement to the next. When we talk about a movement from calendar-based forward guidance to conditional forward guidance, those aren't necessarily the same shocks with the same effects on every asset price. The same is true for switching back and forth between MBS and Treasury purchases for asset purchases. On the other hand, Faust, Rogers, Wang, and Wright also offer a separate critique that basically argues that having a constant H matrix is requiring that the relationship between expectations of state variables and shocks and the relationship between asset prices and state variables are each both linear and constant. So these are fairly strong assumptions to my view. So I'm going to do something different. To motivate my approach, here's a plot of some interest rates from the December 2018 following the December 2018 FOMC announcement. So this is a 25 basis point hike. On the face of it, a contractionary shock, as you see in the 1 month Fed funds futures contract in that conventional 30-minute event study window. But then Chairman Powell, takes the podium for a press conference and starts to speak in a more dovish tone. And surely enough, the longer interest rates start to move kind of continually through the afternoon and indeed start to fall. What I want you to take from this figure is not that there's a single discrete jump in all asset prices during this 30-minute window that reflects all of the information of the announcement being priced in immediately, but rather there's gradual movements in interest rates across the course of the afternoon, particularly in light of press conferences taking place following announcements, that reflects a more gradual incorporation of information into asset prices. So what I'm going to do in my paper is leverage not just a single price change for every announcement day, but an intraday path of asset prices in continuous time, in a continuous time econometric framework, at least, for each announcement, to recover a contemporaneous response matrix HD and thus the underlying monetary policy shocks without assuming that this H matrix is the same from one announcement to the next. By assuming that asset prices respond continuously and having this intraday time path for each announcement, I'm going to be able to identify HD without using any data from a different announcement day. I can identify it using information only from a single day. I'm not going to need to impose assumptions of stationarity across announcements. And it's going to turn out that under typical assumptions, this very high frequency object HD is actually going to coincide with the object one would obtain from an infeasible repeated event study of a single day's data, which I'll talk about in a couple of slides. Within each day, I still need to identify HD. I'm going to do that essentially based on heteroscedasticity using an approach that I developed in a previous paper to identify potentially, but maybe not all of these shocks on any given day, Fed funds, forward guidance, asset purchases, and Fed information shocks. So in the paper, I'm first going to identify these decompositions for every scheduled announcement separately from 2007 to 2019. I'm going to characterize daily historical decompositions to actually measure the shocks. I'm going to talk about which sorts of announcements spark significant shocks, and then look at effects on financial and macro variables. So my setup here, this is just to give you the background, but I think most people in the room will have seen this already. Essentially, I'm thinking about the standard SVR identification problem, but I'm framing things in continuous time for the sake of the econometric setting that I'm working in. There are two natural questions for identification here. First, how is this high frequency response matrix HD for each announcement that I'm identifying going to relate to the lower frequency objects people have been after in the literature previously? And second, how am I actually going to go about identifying HD from the high frequency data? So the first question, if you consider an event study of a single day's data, where we are going to now allow there to be a day-specific contemporaneous response matrix, suppose we could infeasibly resample from that day's GGP as many times as we want, right? Something we can never do in practice. But suppose we could sample from that DGP and we had some valid identification scheme using those repeated samples. The infeasible object that we'd identify there actually turns out to be identical to what I'm going to be able to identify feasibly using the high frequency data which I'm exploiting in this paper. So that speaks to the first question. The object that I'm going to recover is very closely related to what you'd want to ideally get at in an event study that's infeasible in practice. Second, in terms of the actual identification of HD given an inter-day time series, I'm going to exploit some results from my previous work that essentially generalize parametric approaches to identification via heteroscedasticity. I'm going to really recover the unique rotation of the underlying structural shocks that's consistent with the higher moment dynamics of the data, in particular, persistence properties of the structural volatility. I'm going to, in this particular paper, I adapt the argument from my previous work to the continuous time setting that I'm working with here, and the identification conditions turn out to be quite easily testable. So in terms of the empirical model itself, for each announcement day, I'm going to work with minute-by-minute data, essentially representing the same basket of asset prices that Eric works with in his papers. So I'm going to start by recovering 4 principal components of this basket of asset prices to, in principle, capture up to 4 monetary policy shocks. I'm then going to use an information criterion to estimate the dimension of the common component, call that KMP, which is going to be equal to the number of monetary policy shocks active on that given day. Then I'm going to build my empirical model recursively. So I'm going to start with n equal to 4. I'm going to estimate a VAR for the first n principal components to remove any remaining predictability. And then I'm going to test whether I can fully identify the set of structural shocks contained in the residuals of that VAR. If I can, if I do have a fully identifiable model, I'm going to proceed. Otherwise, I'm going to set n to n-1 and go back and repeat this process recursively till I get to a fully identified model. When I do have the largest fully identified model that I can put together here, I'm going to set KS equal to n. This is the number of identifiable shocks. And I'm going to estimate those underlying shocks using a parametric implementation of identification based on time varying volatility, which I just described. Working with the common component of asset prices is important because it allows me to reduce the influence of idiosyncratic noise and also take into account information contained not just in, say, 3 or 4 asset prices. It turns out that for all announcements, the number of identifiable shocks is weakly greater than the estimated number of monetary policy shocks. So any additional shocks can also be discarded as potentially noise. To actually measure the monetary policy shocks, I'm going to work with historical decompositions, which are going to accumulate up the very high frequency effects of these minute-by-minute monetary policy shocks, the sorts of shock measures at 30-day or let's say 2-hour windows that people are much more familiar with working with in the literature. And I'm going to use a statistical criterion that essentially is going to codify the sorts of sign restrictions that people are familiar with in this literature based on economic assumptions to actually label the monetary policy shocks as Fed funds, forward guidance, asset purchases, or Fed information. So moving to the first set of results, for all of the announcement dates I study in the paper, I compute these historical decompositions. But I really focus on 12 key announcements in the paper. I'm going to just look at 3 here to give you a bit of a flavor. So for each of these 3 announcement dates, I'm plotting the decompositions of the asset price movements into Fed funds, forward guidance, and asset purchase and Fed information shocks. But as you'll see, and as I've mentioned before, not necessarily all shocks are active on a given day, and I've let the data tell me which shocks should be active on a particular day. You can see the vertical dashed lines are going to represent the time of the announcement and the end of the conventional 30-minute event study window. And the gray interval is going to essentially represent a 2 standard deviation measure of economic significance as opposed to a measure of statistical significance here, which is a little tricky in a frequentist sense. December 2008, we hit the zero lower bound for the first time. Naturally, a very large Fed fund expansionary Fed funds shock. But it was also a discussion of treasury purchases that many have labeled as probably an expansionary asset purchase shock, which doesn't turn out to be the case, actually, looking at the responses of interest rates here. March 2009, which really doubled down on forward guidance and QE1, is one of the most significant expansionary shocks from this period across identification schemes. And in my results, it's no different. November 2010, launching QE2 is a bit of a different story, though. Here you can see that there's not really a clear effect on any of the asset prices that I'm reporting. And also very interestingly, you can actually see that the effects on the 5-year and the 10-year treasury yield go in the opposite direction. This is something that's easy to accommodate with an H matrix that's specific to any announcement day, but is much harder to reconcile with a previous identification approach that assumes that the relative impact of every asset purchase shock realized on all points on the yield curve is the same from one announcement to the next. Because if we assume that in general, the 5 and the 10-year treasury yields are going to move in the same way in response to an asset purchase, you can never really reconcile these sorts of strange dynamics that we saw in response to the QE2, to the November 2010 FOMC statement. So to summarize the results very briefly, that I go into a lot more detail in the paper, there's only a handful of significant shocks. March 2009, as I described, August 2011, which launches calendar-based guidance, September 2011, which is Operation Twist, September 2013, which delays tapering, and March 2015, which extends forward guidance. These are the launch and extension of policies, as opposed to subtle revisions or changes in language or things like the switch to conditional forward guidance. As I mentioned already, treasury yields can actually move in the opposite direction in response to certain particular asset purchase shocks. And this is a fact that's not compatible with the time invariant decomposition as has generally been adopted. There's also heterogeneity when we look at the response of equities to monetary policy shocks, which again is hard to reconcile with the sorts of assumptions previously made. My findings here are also going to be robust to an alternative identification scheme and a series of placebo tests that I'm able to conduct with other types of announcements. So moving on to the actual response, so a different type of responses. So I've looked kind of day by day, but I want to do the sort of analysis that people have been doing in this literature, for decades now as well. And to do so, I'm going to have to put together some intraday time series. And I'm going to do that by essentially taking the decompositions for certain reference prices and essentially to measure each of the 4 shocks I want to measure here. I'm going to do so at market close, which actually more or less corresponds to the 2-hour window that's used in the Rogers, Scotty, and Wright paper. And here I'm plotting against the shocks recovered by Eric in his paper, and also the Rogers, Scotty, and Wright shocks. You can see for the large part, they are generally quite well correlated, of course, except for the Fed information shock, which is novel in my paper. But for the most part, we see a fairly high degree of correlation, but there are actually certain key episodes where they differ. Don't really have time to go into the examples in detail here, but some examples are Operation Twist, where you kind of see different characterizations. The November 2010 QE2 episode, which I just discussed, shows up quite differently across the schemes, across the approaches as well, and also some issues around the taper tantrum. In terms of the effects on kind of a broader basket of financial variables, I don't want to spend too much time on the results because they're very similar to those in Eric's paper and of kind of vast literature as well when we talk about forward guidance and asset purchases. Generally speaking, the conventional effects I found hold as well. Where my contribution lies is to show that they're still in place, they're robust to including a Fed information shock as well as a control on these regressions. And also I find that the effects of a Fed information shock on each of these variables essentially align with economic theory as well. So I kind of augment these existing findings there. What's more interesting and what I want to spend more time on is the effect, is some of the real effects of this series of shocks that I recover. Because while Rogers et al. And Eric do a great job, I think, identifying the shocks in their paper and studying the financial effects, there's really not been so much work actually applying at least these trio of shocks, and indeed in my case, a quartet of shocks, to study the effects on the real economy. Naturally, it's a little harder of an identification exercise when you start to move through this lower frequency data, but I think still, given the ultimate goals of these policies, a very important exercise. So I'm going to estimate these effects essentially using just standard local projections with some fairly straightforward controls. So here are the effects using my shocks for Fed forward guidance asset purchases and Fed information on inflation, unemployment, industrial production, and monthly frequency with 95% confidence intervals. Looking at forward guidance, you can see there really are no significant or indeed, sizable effects to a forward guidance shock. Looking at an asset purchase shock, on the other hand, you can see notable expansionary effects, certainly statistically significant on unemployment, and essentially on the borderline of this 95% significance threshold, which I think is quite high in kind of this macro literature for industrial production and inflation as well. So asset purchases seems to be quite a statistically significant, has quite significantly statistically significant impacts, and actually quite economically meaningful impacts as well. The Fed information shock, again, doesn't seem to have particularly significant effects here, but depending on the precise specification I consider, some of the robustness checks, I do actually start to see some significant effects of the Fed information shock in essentially the directions that one would expect. The story is a little bit different when I repeat this analysis, and to be clear, this isn't an analysis that was done in the Rogers, Scotty, and Wright paper in the first place, but using their shocks in the same local projections. When I do that, the effects of asset purchases do actually look quite similar. They're actually a little bit more precisely estimated, and if anything, a little bit larger. But the effects of forward guidance look very different, because all of a sudden, forward guidance actually looks like a very contractionary policy exercise. All of the effects are going in the wrong direction. When I do the same with Eric's shocks, the story is again the same for asset purchases, kind of, if anything, larger and more significant effects. But again, forward guidance, at least not for inflation this time, but still for unemployment and industrial production, the effects appear to actually be contractionary. So I think this is a very, while this was not the ultimate focus of my paper, not what I ended up, setting out to discuss, I think it's an interesting open question kind of arising from the analysis of my paper. As I mentioned already, there are a few key episodes where these shock series do meaningfully differ. And I think there's some of the important episodes. So things like Operation Twist, QE2, and some of the behavior around the taper tantrum, but kind of narratively important episodes where you start to get some of the behavior of forward guidance shocks, potentially explaining what is real, going in a certain direction to explain the fact that you can't change the decomposition between asset price movements and into monetary policy shocks from one announcement to the next. So that's the sort of phenomenon that I believe to be going on. In the paper, I go through a lot of exercises to really try to isolate the differences as best I can. So to really kind of tease out what is going to be contributing, what is contributing most to the discrepancy. And at least with the Rogers, Scotty, and Wright routine identification approach, I'm able to really, I'm able to implement that in an intraday fashion. When I implement that in an intraday fashion, the results do start to, where I have this flexibility from one announcement to the next, the results do start to look a lot more similar to those that I obtained, and this forward guidance puzzle does start to disappear. So to quickly conclude, there's quite a few different things going on in this paper, but fundamentally identify kind of these intraday monetary policy shocks separately for every scheduled announcement in 2007, 2019, without assuming that the nature of their shocks or the effects are constant from one announcement to the next, essentially exploiting heteroscedasticity. Uniquely, I'm able to really compare the effects from one announcement to the next, which is kind of the narrative discussion that I gave a little bit earlier. Only a handful of these turn out to be significant announcements, and I talk about which ones that kind of have those effects. And I can cover some sorts of heterogeneity that are hard to explain using previous methodologies. In terms on the financial side, the effects of forward guidance and asset purchases very much look like what the literature's already recovered, but I'm going to add the analysis of the Fed information effect in there as well. And I again recover a decent degree of heterogeneity that's hard to square with some of the kind of previous results. On the real side, I think this is one of the first papers to actually present kind of joint results for all of these different shocks in a single set of local projections or kind of similar dynamic causal effects. I find that asset purchases have a significant stimulatory effect during this period, but other shocks don't. Thanks so much, everyone, for attending, and thanks Eric in advance for what I'm sure we have a very interesting set of comments.
Well, thank you, Daniel, for a great presentation, and I hand it over directly to Eric.
I'll try to share my screen. Let's see. Can you all see that? Do you see my slides? Yes?
Yes, it works.
Okay. So thank you very much for inviting me to discuss this very, very interesting paper. It's a sequel to Daniel's previous paper, which is just published in the Review of Economic Studies last year. So this is more of an application. And I think the previous paper was more focused on the method. I'll give you the method is really, it's complicated when you first see it. The first time I saw a version of this paper, I did have trouble understanding what was going on. So I'll try to give you the idea. the identification here, and maybe that will help you along. Each FOMC announcement day is a separate sample. Okay, so you have many different samples, and you're going to look at each day separately. And then the simple version, sort of the baby version of this paper, would be by Anna Cieslak and Andreas Schrimpf in the Journal of International Economics. They did kind of the same thing, where each day would be kind of a separate sample. And then they did this little 2x2 matrix, and they said, you know, we want to classify an FOMC announcement and decide, is it a regular monetary policy announcement, or was it an unconventional policy announcement, or was it an information shock, or something else? And the way they do it is with this 2x2 matrix. They look at how did stocks and yields co-move that afternoon. Were they negatively correlated, which would be normal, or were they positively correlated, which would be a little more unusual? And then which was more volatile? Was it short-term interest rates or long-term interest rates? So if short-term interest rates are more volatile and stocks move inversely to yields, which would be normal, they would call a conventional monetary policy shock. If long-term yields move more than short-term yields, and stocks move inversely, then that would be more like a forward guidance shock, or maybe an asset purchases shock, okay? And then over in the right-hand column, you have here, well, what if the short rates move more than long rates, but stocks move with yields, which is unusual? That's like an information shock about the economy. So it'd be like the Fed suddenly released some good news about the economy, so stocks go up and yields go up all at the same time. And then if you're going to do the same thing, but with long rates moving more, they call that a risk premium or a risk appetite shock. It just looks like suddenly all the markets want to take on more risk. So all the risky assets tend to go up together. Okay, so this paper is kind of the same idea, but more general. Okay, so in this paper, there are 4 asset price factors or principal components, whereas in the Cieslak and Schrimpf, there was just short rates, long rates, and stocks. So now there's 4 factors. And the number of structural shocks can be bigger than 1 on any given afternoon. In the Cieslak and Schrimpf example, they just categorized that whole afternoon as one type of shock. Okay, in Daniel's approach, you can have many shocks going on all afternoon. You could have all 4 shocks going on over the course of the afternoon. The importances of those shocks can vary over the course of the afternoon after the FOMC announcement. And Daniel has a statistical test for deciding how many shocks were active that afternoon. Was it just 1? Was it 2 or 3 or 4? So there's a statistical test you can go through to get back how many shocks were there. The structural shocks are then estimated and identified using this heteroscedasticity and linearity joint assumption. I'll talk about that in a sec. And then there's a statistical criteria in the appendix for how do you then assign a name to each shock. So which shock is a conventional shock or a Fed fund shock? Which shock is an asset purchases shock? Which one is an information shock? There's a statistical criterion for assigning that name to those different shocks, okay? The key assumption for identification is it's a joint linearity and heteroscedasticity assumption. You can kind of see it in this equation here. So that left-hand side is the observable principal components. You can think of that as the observable asset prices that afternoon. And then on the right-hand side, you have these unobservable structural shocks, epsilon, and those are heteroscedastic during the afternoon. And then this linearity is the H here. And so you can start to see, if you think about it, right, if the epsilons are heteroscedastic and the H's are linear and fixed that afternoon, then you can kind of back out looking at how are the volatilities of the observed asset prices moving around that afternoon. You can kind of say, oh, you know, I can start to back out which shocks are moving more. You know, are some shocks moving a lot and some only a little, and are some shocks, you know, more important earlier in the afternoon and some later in the afternoon? You can kind of all back that out from the joint linearity together with this heteroscedasticity assumption on the structural shocks. Okay, so that's the method in a nutshell. I'm not going to go into more detail than that, although you can look in the paper for more details than that. So my first comment, it's kind of a trivial comment, but it will relate to my next 2 comments, so let me go through it briefly. The paper sample is all scheduled FOMC announcements from 2007 to 2019, so that's a very interesting period, that's great. But why not start earlier, right? I mean, we have the data going back to the 1990s. You know, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in the early 2000s and in the late 1990s, and so it'd be nice to see that. Forward guidance was important in the early days, in the early 2000s. That was what my paper was originally about with Rafet and Brian. And there are many more federal funds rate surprises before 2007, right? Remember, one of the shocks that Daniel is trying to identify is the federal funds rate surprise. There's not very many in this particular sample. In fact, that maybe explains one of my concerns. Here's table 1 in Daniel's paper. The effects of the federal funds rate on, say, the stock market are tiny. And actually the effects on these longer term interest rates are tiny also, right? The 5-year treasury is moving 1/100th as much as the federal funds rate. And that's much, much less than other people like Kuttner or in my own work that we've estimated with samples that go back before 2007. So I think part of the reason these numbers, I think this first column is not estimated well. I think it's because there's not many federal funds rate surprises during this sample. My second, the sample could also be expanded by including intermeeting or unscheduled FOMC announcements. They're typically large. When they do happen, the Fed tends to move a lot if it moves in between meetings. They're therefore econometrically more informative. So it's kind of exactly what you'd want as an econometrician. And I think I think you could make more of a case for heterogeneity if you sort of, because again, Daniel's trying to emphasize the heterogeneity of announcements here. These are some very different announcements, maybe, than the regularly scheduled ones. And it might be nice to demonstrate that, right? This might be exactly what Daniel wants. So I would encourage him to take a look at those more closely. Kuttner, Bernanke-Kuttner, my own papers with Rafet, we all include them. So it's very common to include the intermeeting announcements. All right, so that was my first comment. It's a little trivial. This one's maybe a little more serious. I do think the LP results are a little too speculative, and here's why. So this is the real effects of these 4 different monetary policy announcements. So the paper estimates those real effects on the macroeconomy using local projections. The sample here is very short. It's only from 2008 to 2017. It's not even including 2007 or 2018 or 19. That sample is dominated by the Great Recession and the zero lower bound. I mean, it almost swallows up the entire sample, the ZLB does. Remember, Ramey in her 2016 Handbook of Macro chapter was discussing at length how much trouble she was having with these local projection estimates of the effects of monetary policy on macro variables, even after 1990, with a sample that was maybe twice as long as Daniel's and not even including the zero lower bound. And she was only trying to do 1 shock, not 4. So you've got here, Ramey had a lot of trouble with that. She emphasized the difficulty. And so it's just, it leads me to have real concerns about, how robust are these estimates really. The specification that Daniel uses also has some unusual additional control variables like the stock market. Most of us who run our macro VARs, we wouldn't normally include the stock market as one of the controls. So again, that's sort of just, it's unusual. Why would you include that? It's a volatile variable. That also seems like it might be sort of messing up the results a little bit. If you had a longer sample, as I suggested in my first quote, then you would have, a greater chance of trying to identify some of these things. But even then, because of Ramey's points, I tend to worry about that a little bit. My third comment, and my final comment, since we don't have much time, is a big picture comment. Do the announcement specific results matter much? And Daniel argues that they do, and I have mixed views on this. Yes and no. Previous research tends to estimate the average effects of monetary policy changes on financial markets, sometimes on the economy, but typically on financial markets. The announcement-specific decomposition in this paper is interesting, right? We'd like to know, are the intermeeting announcements different than the regularly scheduled ones? Are the early announcements in the 1990s different from the ones more recently? That would be interesting to know. And so Daniel's method allows us to look at that. So I think that's great. The Fed's forward, I agree that the Fed's forward guidance and asset purchases announcements have differed over time from announcement to announcement, right? Sometimes forward guidance has been a little different. Sometimes the asset purchases have been a little different from one announcement to another. But is the difference between a 2-year ahead forward guidance and a 3-year ahead forward guidance, is that difference very important, right? And so here's where I sort of think the original literature is maybe, just fine in this respect, right? Like, this is interesting in a comparing one announcement to another kind of sense. But if you're trying to estimate macro effects of forward guidance or even financial market effects of forward guidance, these differences between 2-year and 3-year don't seem like a first order thing. It seems like more of a second order difference, right? If you're talking about, is the asset purchases going to be focused on the 5-year or the 10-year treasury? Again, that seems like a second order issue rather than the total quantity of assets being purchased. Okay. The announcement specific effects of changes in monetary policy are hard to estimate. And they're hard to predict ex ante because you're sort of just looking at one day. So it's you really want to sort of pool your days to get more estimates of the effects of these policies. And in the end, Daniel mostly is pooling a lot of those estimates together, like in the macro effects, that he talked about. You're pooling all of those announcements together into one time series and then running your local projections. So in the end, you're sort of abandoning the announcement specific part anyway to do some of these estimates of financial market and macroeconomic effects. So given time, that's really all I have time to talk about here, but this paper treats every FOMC announcement day as a separate sample. He estimates and identifies structural monetary policy shocks for each date using heteroscedasticity and linearity together. You can classify the shocks as Fed funds rate, forward guidance, asset purchases, and information based on a statistical criteria. And then Daniel estimates the effects of each type of shock on financial markets and on macro variables. I think the sample should be expanded. I think it would even help him in many cases because you'll have more heterogeneity if you expand the sample in the ways I mentioned. The local projections results, I have concerns that those are just going to be too fragile and that currently it's probably too speculative. And there's enough in the paper without that. So I think that part of the paper could be dropped or maybe left for future work. Maybe with a longer sample of data and more attention to the problems Ramey was having. And then finally, my question was, do the announcement specific results matter much? My feeling is that mostly the average results are the first order issue that we're usually worried about, but I do think this is very interesting. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much, Eric. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions. So it's the turn of our last speaker, Diego Kenzik, who is going to talk about the unequal economic consequences of carbon pricing. Go ahead.
Fantastic. Can you see my slides? Okay, appears to be working. So first, let me also thank Christiane for organizing this fantastic session. I'm really excited to be a part of it, and I've learned a lot. And I also want to thank Jim, who kindly agreed to discuss my paper. I'm presenting my job market paper. It's titled The Unequal Economic Consequences of Carbon Pricing. The looming climate crisis has put climate change at the top of the global policy agenda. And indeed, there is urgent need for climate action, as emphasized by the most recent IPCC report. Carbon pricing policies are increasingly used as a tool to mitigate climate change all over the world. However, because these policies haven't been in place for that long, still relatively little is known about their effects in practice. Is carbon pricing effective at reducing emissions? What is the impact on output, employment, and inflation? And most importantly, who bears the economic cost of these policies? I think these questions are particularly relevant against the surge in electricity and gas prices that we have witnessed in recent months and growing concern about energy poverty more broadly. In this paper, I present new evidence on these questions from the European Emissions Trading Scheme, short ETS, which is the largest and also oldest major carbon market in the world. I exploit institutional features of this market in combination with high-frequency financial data to estimate the aggregate and distributional effects of carbon pricing. The European emissions trading system is a cap and trade system. So there is an overall cap on emissions covered by the system, and within this cap, allowances are allocated and then traded. Thus, there exists a market price for carbon, and importantly, there are also liquid futures markets. Now, establishing the ETS was a process, and the regulations in this market have changed considerably over time. It is exactly these two observations that motivate my identification design. And the idea is to isolate some exogenous variation in the carbon price by measuring how the carbon futures prices change in a tight window around regulatory policy events concerning the supply of emission allowances. And in the next step, I use this as an instrument to estimate the dynamic causal effects of a structural carbon policy shock. Let me give you a preview of my results. I find that carbon policy has significant effects on both emissions and the economy. A shock tightening the carbon pricing regime leads to a significant increase in energy prices, a persistent fall in emissions and an uptick in green innovation. However, this does not come without a cost. Economic activity falls, at least temporarily, and consumer prices increase actually quite persistently. Importantly, these costs are not borne equally across society. Using detailed household level data, I document that poor households lower their consumption significantly and persistently, while richer households are much less affected. And it turns out that not only are the poor more exposed because of their higher energy expenditure share, they also face a stronger fall in their incomes. And these indirect effects via income and employment turn out to play a crucial role for the transmission of the policy, accounting for about 80% of the aggregate effect on consumption. And finally, I developed a climate economy model with heterogeneity in households' energy expenditure shares, income incidence, and marginal propensities to consume. And I show that a model with these ingredients is able to account for the empirical facts that I document. And in that model, I also show that by redistributing some of these revenues to the most affected low-income households, one can reduce the economic costs of carbon pricing and mitigate the distributional impact without compromising the reductions in emissions to a significant extent. So after this brief introduction, let me give you a bit more detail about my identification design. And as I've mentioned, I'm going to exploit institutional features of the European carbon market. This market was established in 2005 and covers around 40% of total EU greenhouse gas emissions, mainly in the power and heavy emitting industrial sectors. It is a cap and trade system, so there is an overall cap on emissions covered by the system. And to ensure that emissions fall over time, this cap is reduced each year. Within this cap, emission allowances are allocated, and there are different means of doing so, in particular free allocation and auctioning. At the end of each year, companies must surrender sufficient emission allowances to cover their yearly emissions, and this is enforced with heavy fines. Allowances are traded on secondary markets, and there exists both spot and futures markets. So if a company is short on allowances at the end of a given year, it can buy extra allowances on this market. These allowances are also storable. So if a company manages to cut on emissions more than it should have, it can also keep these allowances for future use or sell them at a profit. Now, establishing this emissions trading system did not happen overnight. It was more of a learning by doing process. The system was established in 3 main phases, but even within these phases, the rules have been updated continuously, for instance, to address issues encountered in the market, to expand the coverage of the system, or to improve market efficiency. So there are lots and lots of regulatory events in this market. In this chart, you can see the evolution of the carbon price over the 3 phases of the system that I'm going to consider in this paper. And what I want you to take away from this chart is that there was quite a bit of variation in this price. And this is exactly what I'm going to exploit for identification. In the next step, I collected a comprehensive list of regulatory update events in this market. And these can take the form of a decision of the European Commission, a vote by the European Parliament, or a judgment of a European court. Of key interest in this paper are regulatory news concerning the supply of emission allowances, and in particular, free allocation of allowances and the auctioning of allowances. So in 2012, actually, the default way of allocating these allowances became auctioning. So there are now lots of news regarding the timing and quantities to be auctioned. Before, countries had to submit national allocation plans to the Commission, and the Commission had to approve them. So there are lots of events regarding these allocation plans, just to give you a couple of examples. Going through the official journal of the European Union, I was able to identify 113 relevant events in the period from 2005 to 2018. And the idea based on these events is then to identify a series of carbon policy surprises from changes in the EUA futures prices in a tight window around the regulatory events. So to fix ideas, these surprises are computed as the percentage change in the EUA front contract on the event day and the last trading day before the event. So I'm using a daily event window here. But ultimately, I'm interested in the effects on variables that are only available at the monthly frequency. So I aggregate these daily surprises to a monthly series as follows. This is a standard approach of doing this in the event study literature. In this chart, you can see the resulting carbon policy surprises, and we can immediately see that some of these events led to really large changes in carbon prices, some of them even in excess of 20%. One crucial event occurred in April 2013 when the European Parliament voted against the backloading proposal. So to give a bit of context here, after the global financial crisis, emissions in Europe fell by quite a bit, and this was not reflected in the caps, which were set in a more rigid way. So over time, an oversupply of emission allowances emerged in this system, and the Commission wanted to address this by backloading, by postponing the auctioning of new allowances. But in the first instance, the European Parliament voted against this proposal, sending carbon prices down by quite a bit. And I do a couple of diagnostic checks on this series. In particular, I verify that it is not serially correlated and also not forecastable by past macroeconomic or financial variables. So I hope I could convince you in this short time that this series has some very nice properties, but I will still argue that it is only an imperfect shock measure. Therefore, I won't use it as a direct shock measure, but as an external instrument to estimate the dynamic causal effects on the variables of interest, following an influential approach that was developed by Stock and Watson, and Mertens and Rahn. For estimation, I rely here on VAR techniques because given the short sample, it is challenging to directly estimate its effects using local projections. So you just have to resort to some form of shrinkage. You could alternatively probably also use Bayesian local projections if you favor that approach. My empirical specification includes 8 variables with Euro area data, includes the energy component of harmonized consumer prices and total greenhouse gas emissions, and the macro block, which includes headline consumer prices, industrial production, the unemployment rate, the policy rate, stock market index, and the real effective exchange rate. Now, before I show you the results, as in any IB analysis, we have to take a quick look at the first stage first. The heteroscedasticity robust F statistic is around 21, and therefore there is no evidence that there are weak instrument problems at hand, and we continue by conducting standard inference. In this figure, you can see the responses to a carbon policy shock normalized to increase the energy price by 1% on impact. So we can see that a shock tightening the carbon pricing regime leads to a significant increase in energy prices and a persistent fall in greenhouse gas emissions. Thus, the policy turns out to be successful at achieving its goal of reducing emissions. But this does not come without a consequence. Headline consumer prices also increase, and the pass-through from energy to headline is around 15% at its peak. Industrial production falls, at least temporarily, and the unemployment rate increases. Importantly, however, if you look at the fall in activity, this turns out to be less persistent than the fall in emissions, implying that the emissions intensity improves in the longer term. And I have some additional results that speak to this, which I won't have time today, unfortunately, to talk about in more detail, which concerns green innovation. So I'm also able to document a significant uptick in green innovation after this shock, which I proxy by the patenting activity in climate change mitigation technologies. Monetary policy appears to largely look through the inflationary pressures of this shock. The stock market falls on impact, but then rebounds rather quickly. So overall, these results illustrate this trade-off between reducing emissions and thus the future costs of climate change and lower economic activity today. My results suggest that energy prices play an important role in the transmission of carbon policy. And this suggests that the power sector is able to largely pass through the emissions cost to their customers by increasing energy prices. And in fact, I estimate a relatively strong pass-through of carbon to energy prices. And I have some additional evidence on this based on event study regressions where I show that stock returns in the utility sector actually increase in the short run after such carbon policy shocks. Higher energy prices in turn can have significant effects on the economy via both direct and indirect channel. A carbon policy induced increase in the energy price essentially acts like a tax. To the extent that energy demand is inelastic, this reduces the disposable income of households available for expenditure other than energy. And to the extent that low-income households have a higher energy expenditure share, they are disproportionately affected. This is what I call the direct effect. But the fall in non-energy expenditure ultimately causes a fall in aggregate demand, and this has consequences on the labor market, as I've shown also before, where the unemployment rate increases and wages fall. And this is what I call the indirect effect, which then feeds again back to households, reducing their incomes even further, and so on and so forth. Now, to get a better feeling of these effects, I estimate the impact of the policy on GDP and its components using local projections. Here I use the shock extracted from the VAR to get more power in these regressions, which includes variables that are only available at the quarterly frequency. And the results are shown in this chart. So we can see output also falls significantly after the shock, and the response is more or less in line with the response of industrial production. And by looking at the components, we can see that this is driven by a fall in consumption and investment. And in particular, the consumption response turns out to be quite significant and persistent. Interestingly, when we look at the magnitudes, they suggest that indirect effects may play an important role in the transmission of this policy, because these IRFs are again a shock that is normalized to increase the energy price by 1% on impact. And we can see that the consumption falls by minus 0.5% at the peak of the response. And this is by a magnitude larger than what can be accounted for by the direct effect via energy prices alone, which is theoretically bounded if energy demand is completely inelastic by the energy share of the economy, which is around 5 to 7% in Europe. So this is by a magnitude larger than that. Now, to get a better understanding of the role of these direct and indirect effects, it is instructive to look at the heterogeneous effects of the policy on households. The problem here is that household level microdata are unfortunately not available at the EU level for a long enough and regular sample. So to address this challenge, I focus here on the UK, where high quality microdata on household income and expenditure is available. And if you're concerned about external validity, I've also verified my main results using data for Denmark and Spain. In particular, I'm going to use the living costs and food survey. This is the main UK household expenditure survey. Using the last 20 wave, I compile a repeated cross-section. Unfortunately, this data does not have a panel dimension. So to estimate the dynamic effects, I use a grouping estimator. And in particular, I use a survey question that asks about the normal disposable income as the grouping variable, which I regard as a good proxy for permanent income. And I group households into these three groups: low income, middle income, and high income households. Here you can see some descriptive statistics. And basically what I want you to take away from this are the statistics concerning the energy share, which is on average around 7%. For low income households, it is close to 10%, whereas for high income households, it's only about 5%. So low income households have almost double the energy share of high income households. In this chart, you can see the responses of household expenditure and income for the three income groups that I consider. So we can see that for low income households, expenditure falls significantly and persistently. On the other hand, for middle and high income households, the response turns out to be more muted and much less persistent. And not only are low income households more exposed to the policy because of their higher energy expenditure share, as we have seen before, if you look at household income, we can see that they also face a stronger and more significant fall in their incomes. And this again suggests that these indirect effects via income may be important. Now, to get a better understanding of the relative importance of these effects, it is instructive to look at the cumulative changes to the shock over the impulse horizon in pounds. So these numbers here can be interpreted as the overall adjustment in quarterly expenditure in pounds over the 4-year impulse horizon that I'm looking at. And we can see that energy expenditure increases across the board, even though it's not very precisely estimated. In relative terms, it increases the most for low-income households, which is in line with their high energy expenditure share. But importantly, this increase in energy expenditure can in no way account for the much more significant and substantial fall in non-energy expenditure, in particular for low-income households. And interestingly, these households also face the strongest and most significant fall in their incomes. Now, while I can't establish a causal relation between income and expenditure because I don't have exogenous variation in incomes, it is interesting to observe that the overall magnitude of the fall in income is of a similar order than the overall fall in expenditure. And this is consistent with the interpretation that these households are more financially constrained and thus have a higher marginal propensity to consume and adjust their expenditure more in light of their fall in their income. The situation is very different for higher income households, which also face a non-negligible fall in their incomes, even though it's less precisely estimated. But importantly, their expenditure response turns out to be much more muted. And this is in line with the interpretation that these households are less constrained and better able to cope with adverse effects in their incomes. Overall, my results suggest that these indirect effects via income account for about 80% of the aggregate effect on consumption, while direct effects via energy prices only account for about 20%. And accounting for these indirect effects is also important to gauge the distributional impact. In fact, I show that low-income households make up for about 40% of the aggregate effect on consumption, even though they only account for a much smaller share of consumption in normal times, namely only around 15%. So after accounting for these indirect effects, the policy is actually quite regressive. Now, in the remaining minute or so, let me briefly touch upon what's driving this heterogeneity in the income response. And there are two potential explanations. One is the sector of employment, and the other one is the income composition. So in the interest of time, let us just focus on the first one, which I also believe is the more important one. So households may be differently impacted because they work in sectors of employment, in sectors that are differently affected by the policy. But interestingly, it turns out, if you look at the energy intensity of a given sector, there doesn't appear to be that much heterogeneity along this dimension. So the response of household income in a very high energy intensive sector is comparable to sectors with a lower energy intensity. The sectors where I find the strongest income responses are so-called demand sensitive sectors. So these are sectors that produce more discretionary goods and services, such as retail, hospitality, or other types of private services. And interestingly, these are also the sectors where poor households predominantly work. On the other hand, these low-income households are actually underrepresented in sectors with a very low energy, with a very high energy intensity. So this also helps explain this heterogeneity in the income responses that I document. And let me just very quickly finish with policy implications. So my results suggest that fiscal policies targeted to the most affected households can reduce the economic costs of climate change mitigation policy. And to the extent that energy demand is inelastic, which turns out to be particularly the case for low-income households, this should not compromise emission reductions. And in fact, this intuition is confirmed in my model, which I don't have time to talk about today in more detail. Okay, so let me conclude. In this paper, I provide new evidence on the economic effects of carbon pricing from the European emissions trading system. I show that the policy is successful in reducing emissions and also fosters green innovation, but this comes at an economic cost. Importantly, these costs are not borne equally across society. When we also account for these indirect general equilibrium effects via income, the policy is actually quite regressive. But on the upside, I also show that targeted fiscal policy can actually reduce these costs without compromising emission reductions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Diego, for a fantastic presentation. So Jim Stock is the discussant. And just to let you know, Michelle, our tech assistant, has allowed us to go until 5:55, at which time we will be disconnected. Okay, take it away, Jim. You're still muted.
Sorry about that. Our precious minutes here. Okay, tell me if I'm good now.
Wonderful, yes, it works.
All right. Sorry about that. Okay, so this is a great paper. It's a really interesting paper on a on a highly germane topic, which is what's the effect of carbon pricing on macroeconomics, on the macroeconomic activity. Finds that there's a large effect, and then carefully goes through a variety of different mechanisms and focuses on the heterogeneity aspect and the inequality aspects, impacts of energy prices. It's particularly germane given the high energy prices in Europe that we have at the moment, and that's being driven by the EU ETS. So this couldn't be a more timely topic. The question is a relevant one for, okay, so now I'm really confused on terms of what's actually visible. What are you seeing on my screen? Well, it doesn't matter. I'm just going to go
That's
through
the first slide, yeah. So,
yeah, okay. All right. So the question is a relevant one for the current situation. So if we look at the green line here, this is the emissions intensity of industrial production in the EU, and it's been declining over time, and that's normal. The question is how much of that decline is secular, how much of that is driven by the EU ETS. There's a lot of other policies that have happened at the same time, and the concept here is to see if we can isolate changes in energy prices that are driven by the EU ETS that will driven by the EU ETS that will result in lower emissions. The main finding is really dramatic in terms of the effect on industrial production. That it results in a pretty sharp recession that is pretty quick and lasts for a couple of years, and you can see that in the impulse response here. If I calibrate it to a $40 carbon price, roughly speaking, that would, looking at the 67% band, that would result in a 5 to 12% fall in IP after 1 year. That's about half the size, more or less, of the financial crisis. So the results here are really dramatic, that if you impose a carbon tax or EU through the EU ETS, if you have a trading system and you increase the prices by $40, that's economy-wide, that's going to result in a recession that's half the size of the financial crisis. So we're going to come back to the substance on that. What I am going to do is I'm going to talk about, since this is a methods, there's a lot of methods in this session. I want to focus on just a couple of methods points. And I have no idea whether you're seeing the right slide progressing here or not. So
still seeing the first, now it's good, yes.
Okay, so I see what's going on. So I just activated the wrong screen. It doesn't matter. Let me just make one comment. Just the instrument valid, and it passes simple standard tests. First of all, it is wonderful. I should really stress that it's really exciting to see a creative use of this external instrument approach, applying it to the SFAR-IV, applying it to LPIV, and taking this concept of announcement effects and taking it to just a completely different problem than the monetary policy problems that we're used to applying it to. So I think that is just great. I am really excited to see that. If you do a sniff test, can you predict these announcement effects? You shouldn't be able to, because of changes in futures prices. And it's a good thing you can't. So you can't linearly predict the changes in these futures prices over these announcements. And I have a few statistics here that summarize that. The results I'm going to present that I very kindly got the data from Diego, the results I'm going to present are ones that are starting when the EU ETS started, which is in 2005. It doesn't actually turn out to make any difference, so I'm not going to focus on that. But I think it kind of makes sense if you're looking at like the first stages here to be doing it over the period in which the first stage actually was relevant, which is the EU ETS existing. But it turns out it doesn't really make much difference. So the instrument makes a lot of sense. A priori, it seems to pass standard tests, seems to have moderate strength. Might want to think about a few weak IV things, but seems to be pretty good. So I'm going to make two constructive comments here. One is that given that this is one of these like super instruments, these announcement effect instruments, it actually satisfies what I call in the 2018 Sargon lecture paper, the EJ paper with Mark, we call a condition LPIV. And what that means is that actually it's a valid instrument without any additional conditioning. So while even the only reason you need the VAR part of that is if you're going to be using the VAR to model the dynamics. But if you go via LP, you actually don't need the VAR. You don't need any of the control variables. You might want them. They might reduce standard errors, but you actually don't need them for instrument validity. So I'm just illustrating that here in this slide. And hopefully you can see these orange graphs. Somebody nod their head. Can you see these orange graphs here? Okay, good. And what you can see is that I'm using the config control variables in the first panel, and then I have no control variables whatsoever in the LPIV and the final panel. And these, you have to really squint to see any differences at all. So kind of an interesting feature here is that this is just a confirmation that this instrument is doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing. And it gives you these nice results. I should emphasize, because this has such a super instrument here, you can actually use it to test the invertibility of the original VAR, because it should be the case that in population, the SVAR-IV and the LPIV are going to give you the same results. Now, of course, they aren't the same in sample. And if they're not the same, you can test if they're different. And if they are different, then that suggests that the SVAR itself was not invertible, and you can go with the LPIV. The LPIV standard errors are kind of big, but I think that's a nice feature. I would encourage doing that. We lay out how to do that in our paper. The one comment I will make, since we have we're almost being turned off, is that the numerical values are a lot bigger than the other ones you find in the literature. So I will say that I've got a horse in this race, which is this plot right here, this is for the EU carbon tax over the same period. And this is for the EU ETS over the same period. And one of them you have like a half of a financial crisis for a $40 carbon tax. And one of them just is nothing. There's like no action here at all. So I think I have some thoughts on what the relationship is and how to do the crosswalk on the substance. I think it's really important to nail down the crosswalk between these two sets of results on basically the same countries, using something that on the one hand covers automobiles and fuels, and the other one covers like electricity and industry. So these are pretty closely related, and it's kind of striking that there are these different results. And I think we got to get to the bottom of this. I'm not going to try to do that now. I look forward to talking with Diego in more detail later. Okay, that's it.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Jim, for finishing 1 minute ahead of time, which gives me just enough time to thank all the speakers and discussants for a great session. So I wish we would have had more time to keep on discussing after the session, had we been in Boston today. Yeah, thanks so much, everyone, for coming, and hopefully see you all in person soon. Okay, take care.